It started as a normal morning at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Sarah Matthews stood in the first-class line clutching her expensive leather briefcase, proud of everything she'd earned. That's when she saw him, a tall man in casual clothes trying to board first class. She just couldn't stay quiet. She had to speak up, had to defend her hard-earned territory. She had no idea she was about to stop Barack Obama himself from giving up his first-class seat to a disabled veteran. But it wasn't his famous name that would change her life forever. It was what he said next. Sarah Matthews tapped her expensive high heel against the shiny floor of O'Hare International Airport. The sound echoed through Terminal 3 like tiny thunderclaps. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped her first-class ticket tighter as she checked her watch for the 5th time in 3 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin boarding United Airlines Flight 2847 to Los Angeles, the gate agent announced through the crackling speakers. Sarah straightened her navy business suit and lifted her chin. Being a first-class passenger meant she would board before everyone else, just one of the perks she had earned after 15 years of climbing the corporate ladder. First-class passengers and our premier members may now begin boarding, the agent called out. Sarah smiled to herself as she gathered her designer carry-on bag. Just last week, her boss had promoted her to senior business consultant. At 45 years old, she was finally sitting at the big table where decisions were made. No more middle seats in economy class for her. No more wrestling for overhead bin space with vacation travelers who didn't know proper airplane etiquette. As she stepped toward the priority boarding line, Sarah noticed a commotion near the gate. A very tall man in casual clothes was walking toward the first-class line. He wore a simple navy blazer over a white shirt with no tie, slightly rumpled khakis, and well-worn dress shoes. A worn leather messenger bag hung from his shoulder. Sarah frowned. Clearly, this man had gotten confused about the boarding announcements. It happened sometimes. People who weren't used to flying would accidentally join the wrong line. She had seen it 100 times before. The man's height was impossible to ignore. He must have been at least 6 feet 1 inch, towering over many in the gate area. His long legs carried him with a smooth, confident stride that made other passengers turn their heads. But his clothes? Sarah shook her head slightly. The first-class dress code wasn't officially enforced anymore. But still, there should be standards. More passengers were filtering into the gate area now. A group of excited young adults pressed their faces against the terminal windows, watching planes take off into the crisp Chicago morning. Business people clutched their coffee cups in briefcases, already typing emails on their phones. Flight attendants rolled their bags past with practiced efficiency. Sarah thought about her own journey to the front of the plane, all those years of late nights at the office, missing her daughter's soccer games to finish presentations, fighting twice as hard as her male colleagues to be taken seriously. She had earned every mile of her airline status, every upgrade, every priority boarding pass. The tall man was getting closer to the first-class line now. His face held an expression of quiet thoughtfulness, but Sarah could see the hint of a smile playing at his lips. She noticed his hands, elegant, with long fingers that moved with grace as he adjusted his bag strap. Something tugged at her memory, but she pushed it aside. A pair of college-aged women walked past, then stopped dead in their tracks when they saw the tall man. One grabbed the other's arm, whispering excitedly. Their eyes widened in recognition before they hurried along. The gate agent was sorting through boarding passes, her movements becoming more nervous and rushed as the tall man approached. Other passengers were starting to whisper and point. Sarah felt the first flutter of uncertainty in her stomach, but she squared her shoulders. She had worked too hard to let someone cut in line, no matter how tall they were. The morning sunlight streamed through the terminal windows, catching the gold letters on Sarah's new business cards. Sarah Matthews, Senior Business Consultant. She had ordered them the day after her promotion, along with a new leather briefcase and the navy suit she wore now. Everything had to be perfect, every detail in place. That's how you succeeded in business. That's how you earned your spot in first class. But as the tall man stepped into the priority line just ahead of her, Sarah felt her carefully ordered world begin to tilt. Something about his presence seemed to fill the entire gate area. Even the usual airport noise seemed to dim around him. More people were staring now, and Sarah could hear the excited whispers growing louder. She gripped her boarding pass tighter, her French manicure leaving tiny crescent moons in the paper. She had a choice to make. She could stay quiet, ignore the growing commotion around her, and board the plane like nothing was wrong, or she could speak up, maintain the standards she had fought so hard to uphold. Sarah Matthews had never been one to stay quiet. She cleared her throat and took a step forward, her heels clicking against the floor like a judge's gavel. The tall man turned slightly, And for a moment, Sarah caught a glimpse of his face, those distinctive ears, the thoughtful eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond their years. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the suddenly hushed gate area. "I believe this line is for first-class passengers only." The tall man turned slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. A few gasps echoed through the gate area, followed by the distinct sound of someone dropping their phone. Sarah held her ground, though something in her stomach twisted when she saw his easy smile. "I have a first-class ticket," he said quietly. His voice was deep but gentle, with a measured cadence that was oddly familiar.
Sarah lifted her chin higher. There must be some mistake. First-class passengers usually. She gestured at his casual clothes and worn messenger bag, letting her words trail off meaningfully. More phones had appeared now. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," from somewhere behind her. A young woman tugged on her friend's sleeve and pointed, practically bouncing with excitement. But Sarah was too focused on making her point to notice the growing commotion. "Usually what?" the man asked, still smiling. He shifted his weight, and Sarah noticed how the overhead lights caught a glint of gold on his wrist. Probably just a cheap watch, she thought. The gate agent stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she checked the tall man's boarding pass. "Everything's in order, sir. You're in seat 1A. She shot Sarah an urgent look, but Sarah missed it completely. "There must be some mix-up," Sarah insisted. "I've been flying first class for years, and I know the typical." She paused, searching for the right word. "Clientele." A small crowd had gathered now. Business people who moments ago had been absorbed in their phones were now recording the scene. The college women were whispering rapidly to each other, their eyes wide as saucers. The tall man's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but perhaps a touch of sadness. He reached up to adjust his collar, and the entire gate area seemed to hold its breath. "Ma'am," the gate agent tried again, "I assure you." No, it's okay," the man interrupted softly. "Let me handle this." He turned back to Sarah. "You're right about one thing, there is something unusual about this situation." Sarah felt a flush of victory, but it was short-lived. "The unusual thing," he continued, "is that I was actually going to give up my first-class seat today. There's a veteran in a wheelchair over there who looked like he could use it more than me." He gestured toward an elderly man in a military cap who was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Sarah's certainty began to crack like thin ice. She glanced around, finally noticing the crowd of onlookers, the phones pointed in her direction, the excited whispers that had turned into a steady buzz. "But you know what?" the tall man said, adjusting his messenger bag, "maybe I should keep my seat after all. Seems like there might be a lesson here worth learning." A young woman's voice cut through the tension, "That's President Obama." Her friend hushed her quickly, but the damage was done. Sarah felt the first real tremor of doubt shake her confidence. The gate agent cleared her throat. "Sir, would you like to board now?" The tall man nodded but paused before stepping toward the jet bridge. He looked at Sarah one more time, and this time his smile held a hint of mischief. "By the way," he said, reaching for his ID holder again, "about that typical clientele thing." Sarah's world tilted on its axis as the man finally pulled out his identification. The overhead lights caught his familiar profile, the one she'd seen on television countless times, the same one that had appeared on campaign posters and in history books. The gate erupted in excitement. Phones flashed, people gasped, but Sarah stood frozen, her designer carry-on bag suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Because standing in front of her in his casual clothes and worn shoes was Barack Obama himself. "Still want to check my ticket?" he asked with a gentle smile before turning to make his way down the jet bridge. Sarah Matthews, senior business consultant, who had just gotten her new business cards and never stayed quiet about anything, found herself for the first time in her life completely and utterly speechless. And she hadn't even boarded the plane yet. The gate area buzzed with excitement as Sarah's feet seemed glued to the floor. Her mind raced through a highlight reel of the last 10 minutes, every word she'd said, every assumption she'd made, now playing back in horrifying clarity. Ma'am, the gate agent's voice barely penetrated her daze. Would you like to board now? Sarah nodded mechanically, her designer heels suddenly unsteady beneath her as she made her way down the jet bridge. Fragments of conversations from other passengers floated around her like autumn leaves. Can you believe she didn't recognize President Obama? In Chicago of all places. Did you get it on video? The memories hit her like a succession of gentle waves, each one bringing new understanding. The casual clothes that spoke of a man who no longer needed to prove himself. Her daughter Jenny's voice echoed in her mind from just last week. Mom, you never listen when I talk about current events. Sarah paused at the entrance to the aircraft, letting a family with small children go ahead while she gathered her composure. The flight attendant greeted her with a smile that held just a hint of judgment. Welcome aboard. First class is to your left. First class where Barack Obama sat in seat 1A, where she would have to spend the next 4 hours pretending this morning hadn't become a social media nightmare in the making. She stepped into the cabin, and there he was, the 44th President of the United States was settling into his seat, politely declining a pre-flight drink from an awestruck flight attendant. His navy blazer, the one she had dismissed as too casual, probably cost more than her entire outfit. Sarah's seat was 2C, directly behind him. Of course it was. As she stowed her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, her hands trembling slightly, she caught snippets of a conversation between Obama and the flight attendant. It's no trouble at all, he was saying. Could you make sure that veteran in 14B gets whatever he'd like during the flight? On me. The same veteran he'd been planning to give his first-class seat to, Sarah realized. Her face burned hotter. More passengers filed past her seat, many slowing down to stare at Obama, some pulling out phones until the flight attendants gently reminded them that photos weren't allowed. A young girl walked past with her mother, her eyes wide as saucers. Obama gave her a friendly wave, and the child looked like she might faint from joy. Sarah sank into her seat, wishing it would swallow her whole. She pulled out her phone, dreading what she might find. Already, her daughter had sent 3 messages. Mom, is it true? Everyone's talking about it on Twitter. Please tell me you didn't really try to stop Barack Obama from boarding first class. Gets trending. Twitter. Of course it was on Twitter. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering all the times she'd lectured Jenny about jumping to conclusions, all her speeches about treating people with respect. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. A memory surfaced Jenny at age 10, proudly showing her the book she'd saved up to buy, a memoir by Barack Obama. He's not just a president, Mom, Jenny had insisted. He's teaching people they can make history. Sarah had barely glanced at it, too busy preparing for a meeting. That's nice, honey, she'd said, shuffling papers just like she'd barely glanced at the man in the navy blazer today, too busy guarding her precious first-class line. The cabin doors closed with a heavy thunk. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, but Sarah barely heard them. She was lost in thought, remembering all the times she'd felt judged in her own career, all the times men had assumed she was the secretary instead of the consultant, all the times she'd had to prove herself worthy of a seat at the table. And what had she done with all that hard-won wisdom? She'd turned around and judged someone else based on their clothes, their appearance, their failure to meet her standards of what first class should look like. The plane began to push back from the gate. Up in seat 1A, Barack Obama pulled out a book, not a celebrity magazine or tabloid, but what looked like a thick biography. Sarah remembered reading somewhere that he was an avid history buff. Another assumption shattered. As they taxied toward the runway, Sarah Matthews, who had spent her career breaking through glass ceilings, realized she had some breaking to do of a different kind, starting with her own prejudices. And they hadn't even taken off yet. As the plane climbed through the clouds, Sarah's mind drifted back to her first day at Marshall & Brooks Consulting 15 years ago. She'd walked into the office wearing a suit almost identical to the one she wore now, navy blue, perfectly pressed, a shield against a world that often judged women in business before they could prove themselves. "Are you here to take notes for the meeting?" a senior partner had asked, not even looking up from his newspaper. "No," she'd replied, steel in her voice. "I'm here to lead it." That moment had been the first of many the coffee runs she was expected to make despite having an MBA from Northwestern, the clients who would look to her male junior colleagues for answers even when she was the senior consultant, the constant need to prove herself over and over in a world that seemed determined to put her in a box. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting Sarah back to the present. Up in seat 1A, Barack Obama calmly turned another page in his book. A flight attendant hurried past, apologizing for the bumpy air. 20 years of flying in turbulence still gets to me, the woman across the aisle whispered to Sarah with a nervous laugh. Sarah managed a small smile, remembering another conversation from long ago. She'd been complaining to her mother about the challenges at work, the constant battle for respect. "Just remember, honey," her mother had said, "fighting prejudice means fighting all prejudice, not just the kind aimed at you." She hadn't really understood what her mother meant back then, or maybe she hadn't wanted to understand. It was easier to focus on her own struggles, to wear them like badges of honor. Each promotion, each success became another brick in the wall she built around herself, a wall that was supposed to protect her but had ended up blinding her instead. The seat belt sign dinged off. Several passengers immediately stood up, not to retrieve items from the overhead bins but to casually walk past Barack Obama's seat, each one trying to sneak a photo or just get a closer look at the former president sitting in 1A. Sarah watched as Obama handled each interruption with grace, offering small nods or quick smiles, no annoyance, no superiority, just quiet dignity. She thought about how many times he must have dealt with people's assumptions, both positive and negative, throughout his career. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Jenny: "Mom, Barack Obama is my hero. He broke barriers. He wrote books that changed lives. How could you not know who he was?" A memory surfaced: Jenny's 12th birthday party. She'd begged for an Obama Yes We Can poster for her room. "He shows that anyone can achieve their dreams, Mom," she'd said. "That's how he became president." Sarah had said no. She'd wanted Jenny to focus on academics, on practical pursuits. "Politics is just a game," she declared. Now she wondered how many other important things she dismissed without really looking, without really understanding. The flight attendant appeared with drink orders. "Sir," she said to Obama, "the veteran in 14B wanted to thank you for the meal." Obama nodded. "Make sure he gets my card before we land. And please, no announcements or fuss." Sarah sipped her club soda, remembering the countless times she'd insisted on recognition for her achievements. Every award, every promotion had to be acknowledged, documented, added to her carefully crafted image of success. But true success, she was beginning to realize, might look different than she'd imagined. It might wear a casual blazer and worn shoes. It might give up a first-class seat to a veteran without wanting any credit. It might handle prejudice with grace instead of anger. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the seat belt sign dimming with a soft ding. They were 7 miles above the earth, but Sarah had never felt more grounded or more ready to learn. And they still had 3 hours until Los Angeles. The drink cart rattled down the aisle again as the plane cruised somewhere over Nebraska. Sarah stared at her half-empty glass of club soda, watching the bubbles rise and pop, each one feeling like another moment of her carefully constructed image dissolving away. A child's voice piped up from economy class: "But Dad, I have to go to the bathroom." "It's up there." The desperation in his voice made it clear that the bathroom wasn't his real destination. Sarah heard Barack Obama chuckle softly. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out something small, a book, she realized. He handed it to the flight attendant with a whispered request. Moments later, she heard the boy's delighted gasp from the back of the plane. "Dad, look! It's signed." Such a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Sarah thought about all the times she'd brushed off people asking for her business card at conferences, thinking she was too important for networking beginners. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, harder this time. Sarah's drink tipped, sending club soda cascading across her tray table and onto her navy suit. She grabbed for napkins, but they were already soaked. "Here," a deep voice said, offering a handful of dry napkins. Barack Obama had turned around in his seat, those famous hands extending help to the very person who had tried to block his path just hours ago. "Thank you," Sarah managed, accepting the napkins. Their eyes met for the first time since the gate, and she saw no judgment there, only a kind of understanding that made her throat tight. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to get turned away from places too. Even after I became a senator. Some people saw the brown skin, the name Barack Hussein Obama, and made up their minds before I could say a word." Sarah's hands froze in the middle of blotting her suit. "I'm so sorry about what happened at the gate," she said, the words feeling insufficient but necessary. "I was completely wrong." He smiled, but it wasn't unkind. "We all are sometimes. The trick is learning from it." A flight attendant appeared with fresh napkins and a new club soda, fussing over the spill. Obama turned back to his book, but not before saying, "Your seat's pretty wet. There's an empty one up here if you'd like to move." Sarah looked at the offered seat 1B, right next to Barack Obama. The same seat she'd been so sure he didn't deserve to be anywhere near just hours ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. As she gathered her things to move, her phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from her boss. "Saw the video from O'Hare. We need to talk when you land." Her stomach dropped. Everything she'd worked for, all those years of proving herself, might have been undone by 30 seconds of prejudice caught on camera. "Bad news?" Obama asked as she settled into the seat beside him. He noticed her expression change. "I might lose my job," she admitted, surprised to find herself confiding in him. "A video of what happened. It's gone viral." He nodded thoughtfully. "You know what's funny? When I first started in politics, people said I'd never win with a name like mine. The pundits called me unelectable." "But you're Barack Obama," Sarah said before she could stop herself. He laughed. "Wasn't always. Had to become him. Had to learn from every setback, every criticism, every time someone said I didn't belong. Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our best chances to grow." The flight attendant appeared again. "Mr. President, the veteran in 14B asked me to give you this." She handed him a folded piece of paper. Obama read it, smiled, and carefully tucked it into his book. "Sometimes the best seat isn't in first class," he said quietly, almost to himself. Sarah thought about the veteran, about Obama's attempted gesture at the gate. "You were really going to give up your seat for him, weren't you? Even before everything that happened?" He nodded. "Success isn't about where you sit on the plane. It's about what you do with the seat you have." A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some turbulence as we cross the Rockies. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Sarah clicked her seatbelt, noticing how different everything felt from this seat, not because it was in first class, but because of how she'd gotten there, through humility, through learning, through someone else's grace. "Can I ask you something?" she said, gathering her courage. "How do you handle it? People making assumptions about you all the time?" Obama set his book down, marking his place with the veteran's note. "I remember that everyone's fighting their own battles. Like that veteran back there, he fought real ones. Or like you." Sarah blinked in surprise. "You think I haven't read the business magazines? First woman senior consultant at your firm. Had to work twice as hard to get half the respect. Probably dealt with more prejudice than I ever did." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. He had recognized her too, not from the gate incident, but from her accomplishments. And instead of using that knowledge to shame her, he'd used it to understand her. The plane shuddered as they hit the promised turbulence, but Sarah barely felt it. She was too busy realizing that sometimes the biggest obstacles we face aren't the prejudices aimed at us, but the ones we carry within ourselves. And they still had 2 hours to Los Angeles. By the time the plane began its descent into LAX, Sarah had learned more about leadership, humility, and true class than in 15 years of corporate climbing. Barack Obama had shared stories from his time in office, not to impress but to connect tales of moments when he'd misjudged situations, when he'd had to learn hard lessons about his own assumptions. When the wheels touched down and the engines reversed thrust, Sarah knew one thing with certainty: she'd boarded the plane as one person and would leave it as another. You know what I tell young people when they make their first big public mistake? Obama asked as they taxied to the gate. What's that? I tell them to own it, not just the mistake, but the learning that comes after. Because people don't just watch us when we're winning. They watch us when we fall to see if we'll get back up. As passengers began gathering their belongings, Obama reached into his bag and pulled out a business card. This is for Jenny, he said, handing it to Sarah. For my foundation's youth leadership program. Tell her there's a spot waiting for her. Sometimes we need to let our kids spread their wings, even if we're scared they'll fall. Sarah took the card with trembling fingers. I never asked, she said as the plane came to a stop. Why did you really keep your first-class seat today? You were going to give it to the veteran before. Obama's smile held a hint of mystery. Maybe the lesson wasn't just for you. As the chime sounded and people began to stand, Sarah put out her hand. I'm Sarah Matthews, she said formally. And I'm sorry I didn't properly introduce myself before. He took her hand, his grip warm and firm. Barack Obama. And you know what, Sarah Matthews? Sometimes the best introductions come after we've already learned each other's character. Sarah watched him make his way down the aisle, stopping to thank the veteran in economy class before disappearing into the terminal. Only then did she unfold the note he'd left her. In clear, elegant handwriting were words that made her tears finally fall. First class isn't a seat. It's an attitude. Thanks for teaching me that today, too. Blow. And they had finally landed.